the record. The book is a record of a really unique project, the Novella project, Narratives of Varied Everyday Lives and Linked Approaches, which is a program conducted with the National Centre for Research Methods. I'm Corinne Squire. I was part of the Novella project and also one of the co-editors of the book. You're going to be hearing from a number of people associated with the project and writers in the book, in particular Anne Phoenix, who was the leader of the program, as well as many of the authors, including Julia Brannan, who's also a co-editor of the book, and also from Roz Edwards, who was strongly involved with the book, helping the development of it through NCRM. We're going to see a short film about the project as well, and then we're going to have some time at the end, hopefully quite a large amount of time for discussion. Some housekeeping points just to make here. If you want to use the chat for making points, giving information, asking questions or comments, please do that. We'll go back to that during the discussion period. And of course, you'll also be able to use the raise hand function in the discussion time as well. And also, we've just had a message on the screen asking you to consent for recording. We're recording so that other people can have access to this session. Just the speakers parts, not the discussion section at the end, though. And finally, if you can remember that you're going to be on mute when you're not speaking, that will be really helpful. So just to start off really, as someone who was involved with Novella, but also with narrative research before and after Novella, principally through the Centre for Narrative Research, which is now the Association of Narrative Research and Practice. I just think that there are a lot of things that narrative researchers and qualitative researchers generally can learn from Novella. And I just want to list a few of those things really. And these would include Novella's really strong attention to theory of method, which is not always present. Its collaborative and interdisciplinary character, which was extremely consistent. Its multimodality, its long-term, slow scholarship characteristics, its attention through narrative to language, its participant-centeredness, and also its commitment to working across Global South and Global North contexts. And I think really that a lot of our researchers, narrative researchers and qualitative researchers generally, can learn from that, which is really well documented in this book, I think. So I want to hand over now to my colleague Molly Andrews, who's going to talk a bit more about this relationship. Molly.
Hi, thank you. So hello everyone and welcome. It's really, I want to show you, for those of you who have not actually gotten to see the book, here it is. A beautiful book, which actually Corinne has distributed discount vouchers for as well. I want to say just a few words about Novella and also for me personally what it meant to be involved with this really wonderful project. As Corinne said, Novella was actually a project which was funded by the ESRC from 2011 to 2014. And it was one of only 6 nodes of the phase 3 of the National Centre for Research Methods. And I think that it was really the only one to focus primarily on in-depth qualitative research. Although, of course, as you'll see, we did actually have some components which were also using quantitative work. But Novella was really a vast umbrella. It encompassed 6 interrelated studies. They all used narrative methods in some way. And these different projects were assembled to try to understand the complexity of everyday habitual practices of families. So we were interested in not only what people do, but also what people say they do and how they understand their own, quote, taken for granted practices. Many of the projects with Novella were based on secondary analysis of data sets. We're going to talk about that later today. But they also included gathering new data. So integral to Novella also was the training program component. And this extended not only to wonderful PhD scholars who now are very much post-PhD, who we hear from later today, and also postdocs, but also there were a number of training events, which were quite exciting places where we talked about the nuts and bolts of how to do multi-layered research projects, which are both complete in themselves, but critically, which form part of a network of projects which explore related topics. So there were many aspects of Novella which were, well, I'll be corny and say which were novel, but they were, for me, what was perhaps most remarkable was the way in which it was holistically conceptualized. So for instance, linking quantitative longitudinal analyses with narratives which were produced at a particular time points, or matching narrative data across studies. And although each of the projects within Novella produced its own interesting outcomes, it was really their collectivity. It was in their collectivity that the contribution was most significant. So on a personal note, I can say that I've never worked in such a genuinely collaborative environment. Often there's lip service, which is paid to a feminist leadership, but I think we really saw this in practice here. And it was really my great honor to be a part of this project. So without further ado, I would now like to introduce Anne Phoenix, who was the director of Novella, and without doubt, its inspiration and guiding light, and Julia Brannan, who was co-investigator on Novella and principal investigator of one of the project's families and food, parenting, identities, and practices. Julia is professor of sociology of the family at the Thomas Corm Research Unit at the Institute of Education, and her research over 30 years has focused on families and young people, the relation between paid work and family life and intergenerational relations. And now to Anne. Well, in addition to having been the director of Novella, Anne Phoenix is professor of psychosocial studies at the Institute of Education at UCL. She's a fellow of the British Academy and a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. And amongst her many other accomplishments, Anne is currently a member of Independent Sage Behavioral Advisory Group. So Anne and Julia, over to you.
I think I'm going first. We thought we'd begin, hello everyone, first of all. We thought we'd begin with a little bit of funding history, because we think this will tell you something of the spirit that guided Novella and the book we're celebrating today. Between 2004 and 2010, I served on the ESRC's board that funded research methods development and on various related advisory groups. And during this time, a large amount of funding was invested by ESRC into the development of research methodology. First of all came the ESRC Research Methods Festival, an innovative idea implemented by Angela Dale to bring together a vast range of researchers and methodologies. The idea was to let all the flowers bloom, and the festival created a great deal of cross-border learning and methodological enhancement. The successor to this program was the ESRC National Research Methods Center. This was, I think, even more innovative because it provided funding for mini research method centers called research nodes, at the center of which was a research hub. One of the nodes was Novella, and it was funded under the second tranche of this hub and mode funding. And nodes focused on 3 strands of work: original substantive research, the development of methodology, and the cascading of methodological knowledge to the wider research community. The original vision of the National Research Methods Centre wasn't only innovative, it also meant, I think, that funding was allocated relatively democratically across a variety of universities, not only those deemed to have developed a critical mass of researchers. In addition, institutions were encouraged to collaborate, and its implementation also underwent evolution. Additional pots of funding were provided for researchers to attend training courses throughout the country, for add-on research projects for the nodes, 2 of which Novella successfully got funding for. And those at the coordinating hub gained some funding for their own research. So I'm mentioning these things so that you can understand the uniqueness of the model that informed the shape and the workings of Novella. Novella, to reiterate and say something about what it afforded us, the opportunity to develop research in relatively unconstrained ways after the proposal was granted, funded, with a number of, as Molly's talked about, 6 projects, which we'll talk about later. The opportunity to focus on one research approach, narrative, in all its different meanings, and to explore different ways of analysing narrative data. It enabled us to draw on different data sources, semi-structured interviews, diaries, oral histories, cohort data, an international study, blogs, online blogs, and Peter Townsend's historic study, Poverty in the UK. It gave us the opportunity to invite high-profile writers and researchers in the field of narrative to visit Novella and to share and discuss their ideas, not only with those of us working on Novella, but also other interested researchers. So in retrospect, I think this model of research is a beacon of light for those who believe that research is a craft that is learnt through practice and through working in collaborative ways. In my view, the morphing of the ESRC Research Methods Centre into its current form, a training centre, offers a much less progressive model. It centralises funding and risks reducing methodology to a matter of training courses. And now I'd like to pass to you, Anne, to talk about Novella.
Thank you. And Julia has so helpfully sketched out the socio-structural background that enabled such a large and, as many of us will say, successful program to thrive with so many of us. But I want to, and I think this is important for people who want to do work of this kind, I want to talk about the way in which institutionally it was also enabled and how it came about that we came together. So first of all, our application was made possible because those of us who came together to produce it initially were in the Thomas Coram Research Unit. And that mattered because it was a site where there was already 40 years experience of doing policy relevant research on families, children, young people, and parenting of different kinds. And that meant that we had a range of meta-analytic ideas that we discussed sort of in passing and sometimes at greater length regularly. And it also meant that we had methodological puzzles coming from many studies that we wanted to explore. Equally important, we were used to coming together quickly to devise proposals in large groups, and sometimes those groups would whittle down and people would be happy to give their ideas knowing that they then wouldn't be part of a project, but which they wanted to see funded because they were committed to the area and to the research unit. And we were used to doing that both responsively, as when, for example, the ESRC announced this NCR, National Centre for Research Methods funding, and also proactively when we had ideas that we wanted to follow up. The project we eventually came up with was called Habitual Practices in Everyday Family Lives, Understanding Constructed Meanings by Mixing Methods. I think you'll see it trips off the tongue. And we were asked to change the title immediately. We were funded because it was felt that it didn't quite actually sort of easily fit with something that people would remember. A major impetus for the study was to attempt to capture the complexity of the everyday. In the social sciences, there's general agreement that routine everyday practices are central to the understanding of identities, agency, social life. But when people try to capture the everyday, they frequently fail to capture the complexity. The mundane, they assume, is simple, and it's not. So not surprisingly, when some studies do attempt to capture the complexity, they often have to rely on very, very small samples. Well, a well-funded large node consisting of several studies allowed us new possibilities to think afresh. And we decided on a cross-institutional collaboration that would allow us to develop and showcase methods and approaches that capture the complexity of the everyday and do so across relatively large data sets, large for qualitative and also quantitative, which are larger anyway. Centrally concerned with the meanings that families and different family members themselves make in different contexts and different countries. So we foregrounded narrative methods, but we wanted to see how we could combine narrative methods with other qualitative and quantitative approaches. And we also wanted to take forward understanding of the narrative research by doing it in different ways. And for that reason, we turned to Corinne Squire and Molly Andrews, who you've heard from already. And with Maria Tambuku, they'd already long founded the Centre for Narrative Research. This had a national and international reputation for leading narrative research and theorization, and doing so in flexible ways rather than rigidly telling everybody what narrative consisted of and how it had to be done. So our partnership with them meant that Novella could provide training in narrative methods led by some of the foremost international narrative scholars who were part of the Centre for Narrative Research networks. And I'm so delighted to see that Kathy Riesman is here today as one of those foremost international narrative scholars. So that collaboration contributed to fulfilling the National Centre for Research Methods requirement that the node should make a step change in research methodology training. And this was in addition to the methodological courses in the substantive projects. So each of the substantive projects also did training and that we provided. Well, our ideas were novel, there's no doubt about that. But I think it's always salutary to remember that they depended on other researchers' work. I've already mentioned the importance of the Thomas Coram Research Unit and the partnership with the Centre for Narrative Research and the international scholars that they brought into the node. But I want to mention 4 other sets of theoretical and methodological work that we drew on, and there could be others, of course, but these were very important. First was Bren Neal and Janet Holland's ESRC-funded Timescapes project, and that was a pioneering qualitative longitudinal research methods project that built qualitative longitudinal data resources for sharing and for reuse. So recognizing how difficult it is to do qualitative longitudinal work, making it available to other people. Second was Janet Heaton's work on reuse of qualitative data, which really helped us see how it could be done. Third, it was a period when there was a burgeoning of theorization of practices, and we benefited from David Morgan's family practices, theorization, and also practice theory, also related to climate change, laid out by Elizabeth Shove, and practice theory also in the everyday in terms of habits and practices from Sarah Pink and Lydia Martins. All of those were helpful to our devising the project in the first place. And then fourth, Jane Elliott, who's part of the node, her commitment to both quantitative and qualitative narrative methods was key. And we developed 4 methodological objectives in the proposal. First, psychosocial. So we wanted to have an interdisciplinary approach that brought together the personal and the socio-structural in the study of narratives to look at habitual practices in everyday family lives. And that was with a view to getting a more holistic and complex focus on individual agency, identities, and all in sociocultural contexts. Then mixed methods, and I think Julia said something about that, and more will be said later. So mixed methods, secondary narrative analyses, qualitative and quantitative data sets. Then the intergenerational and life course perspective, which was common within Thomas Coram anyway, and indeed in a lot of other sociological and psychological work, but we wanted it foregrounded. And overall, an intersectional approach at a time when not quite as many people were taking that approach as do now. So we wanted particularly to think about ethnicization, racialization, gender, generation, migration, etc., and to see how they came together. And in addition, we wanted our theoretical, methodological, and public policy contributions to be informed, as Molly said and Julia said, by international comparisons, as well as comparisons across ethnicized and racialized groups, and for people who are both for people who are migrants and non-migrants. So we had many research questions, you can imagine, with the different projects, but there were 3 organizing concerns. First, we wanted to interrogate the link between what people do and what they say they do. And I think it's Molly who said that already. Secondly, to analyze the ways in which family members understand their practices, so meaning making, narratives central to that. And third, to document and make accessible the process of conducting secondary narrative analysis and matching data across a range of data sets. And I have to say that when we started off, I thought that was a rather simpler task than I learned that it was later on. But nonetheless, it was you know, at the heart of what we were doing. And I quickly want to share my screen to show you what the program of work looked like. So a representation here. Don't worry, this is the only slide. Oh, it's disappeared here. Julia's already talked about the training and capacity building function that we had, and we did that in a number of ways. And you'll see a bit of the film that was produced just now. And I think Molly and Corinne have talked about some of the training already. Throughout all the projects, there were conceptual connections and methodology that ran through them all. First of all, the concern with family habitual practices, and we've talked already about the other things in purple on the left. And then the projects themselves. We had these 3 main projects, which themselves had other projects within them. And then we added to them the 2 projects, smaller projects on food blogs and paradata that you'll hear about. And I want to thank the NCRM's vision for actually insisting that once the 6 nodes that Molly mentioned were funded, that we had to link across the nodes to do projects together. So that even though we had very different methods across the nodes, we had to think how we did those. And I think you'll hear about those and what the links were. So that's all that I have to say, but I want to hand back over to Julia now to talk a bit more in detail about some projects and her involvement.
Hi, I think I'll have to hurry through this, but the first project, one of the projects I was involved in, was called Parenting and Identities Project. And I was delighted when Anne invited me to bring some of my own data that had been collected on another project that I directed, and to carry out secondary analysis in the project. Project was called Fatherhood Over the Generations, and we had collected life stories from men across the generations. The secondary analysis was led very creatively by Heather Elliott. And one of the unusual features of this project was that we carried out group analysis, which was unusual in the sense that the team of analysts involved the original researchers and a researcher entirely new to the data. Novella also allowed us, as Anne suggested, to take this work in engagement and training method, part of the training program, to take it to other research groups who also wanted to do narrative analysis. And together in, I think, Exeter and Belfast, we analysed parts of our interviews collectively and wrote up collaboratively a research paper. A further opportunity, Anne also mentioned, was to work with the Millennium Cohort Study, which was led by Jane Elliott. And with them, we analysed longitudinal data on fatherhood in dialogue with data from the study I've just mentioned, the Fatherhood Across the Generations study. This quantitative collaboration enabled the team to create a statistical analysis, a narrative from the Millennium Cohort data, a national story, and it was enabled us to chronicle the temporal changes in fathers' involvement over time. And it also allowed us to juxtapose this with a subsample of fathers who were selected to be comparable with the MCS fathers from the other data set. And so in integrating these two types of data, we created an extensive and an intensive picture of fatherhood in a particular period, which was both complex and nuanced. And methodologically, we reflected on the importance of the different members of the team and our relation to the data and the different types of data, the significance of time from when we collected the data, and the ways in which life stories, personal accounts, and statistical data can all constitute narrative and are routes to understanding historical and contemporary contexts. A second project I was involved with was the Food and Families in Past Times project. And again, this project involved using existing data, archival data. And it involved discussing cascading methodological insights more widely. However, unlike the other project I just talked about, we didn't carry out secondary analysis because these data had not been previously analysed by social scientists, to our knowledge anyway, or hadn't been collected for research purposes. The analysis was very ably led by Abigail Knight, an historian and social scientist, with the assistance of Rebecca O'Connell and myself. The first data set we examined were diaries written in 1950 to 51, solicited by mass observation. And the Second World War years had already received a lot of attention. So we thought that early 1950s was also a time of national hardship with food rationing still in place and therefore worthy of attention. As we know, as researchers, food practices tend not to be reflected upon and are not easily elicited by many of social sciences' conventional methods. They're so embedded in everyday life, and so we expected the data to be patchy and uneven. However, we thought that the mass observation diarists might report on these matters because food supplies at the time were so disrupted in Britain. We found that references to food and food provisioning were often brief, consisting of small stories in Bamberg's sense. The data were also dependent on the diarist's gender. So it was paramount in this study to contextualize the diaries in other contemporaneous data, photos of the period, surveys done at the time. And we also noted the wider political context in which the Conservative Party was seeking to wrest power from Labour's welfare state government, and so was lobbying heavily for an end to rationing. We spent time on this project considering the use of visual materials to supplement the accounts of shopping and cooking from the mass observation diarists. And after searching several archives, we selected a cookbook and some photos from the Imperial War Museum. In this way, we hope to gain some idea of the materiality of food. In the case of the cookbook, we could see which foods were being recommended at the time as substitutes for fresh eggs and cream. Through the images of party food in the book, we could see how middle-class people, in the face of hardship and impending changes to Britain's class system following the Second World War, sought to maintain their place in the world and to retain their accustomed lifestyles and desire for entertaining. In the Imperial War Museum archive, we found photos of mothers queuing outside shops, a practice now in vogue again. The latter complemented a mass observation diarist that we analysed of the amount of time food shopping took at the time. It also captured the look of the shops at that time. But these images made us mindful methodologically that photographs of a past reality have to be interrogated in the same way as textual material. By whom were the photos taken? In what context? And for what purpose? The images in the cookbook needed to be interpreted as idealized representations of middle-class food practices and may not have measured up to the everyday food practices even of our mass observation middle-class diarists. We also drew on a third type of archival data, an oral history community archive, and we examined its publicly available online transcripts to look at food practices around World War I. This archive related to a very specific rural community, Ambleside in the Lake District. And we tried to compare these oral histories with a local archive in East London, a very different kind of place. In this use of archival data, we noticed that mention of food practices, at least in the Ambleside data, occurred in response to direct questions, and that the interviewers, who were local people and not social scientists, tended to steer the interviewees by bringing in their own knowledge of the local customs or what they'd learnt from previous interviews. It's also the case that the interviewees contrasted past ways of food provisioning with contemporary practices, underlining how the past is interpreted from the vantage point of the present. So I'm just going to wrap up. I want to reiterate and endorse what Anne has said about the importance of the collaboration with Corinne and Molly, which was so key to its success, and also the opportunity to have research students who were allied to the Novella program. We so valued the opportunity to engage with different types of data from a narrative perspective, to engage with data reuse and secondary analysis, and making us, as Anne suggested, an alert to the challenges and pitfalls of this. It brought home to us caveats about all knowledge being partial, that interpretations of data is not only what's in front of us, but is influenced by our multiple and temporal positionings. And these shifting positionings mean we should never be complacent about the conclusions that we reach in our research. For myself, the narrative focus enabled me to bring together two separate concerns, a concern with the influence of history and a concern with everyday contemporary family life. In Jill Bradbury's words, narrative methodologies engage the question of human subjectivity, both retrospectively and prospectively, working simultaneously with the longitudinal trajectories of socio-historical time and the unfolding minutiae of quotidian personal life. And we're now going to show the film made for us by Bhavish Hinocha. This will give you some idea of us all at work on Novella and its research. Thank you. Over to you, Thompson.
So each project in Novella is very different. It's addressing its own questions and it's using its own methodology. But what brings them together is that they're all concerned to answer the same theoretical questions and also to address some methodological issues in common. So the theoretical issues are to do with understanding the way in which families talk about their identities, their practices, and their values, and how different members of the family negotiate those. And methodologically, we're concerned to understand the way in which it's possible to reuse data, material collected for one study in another, and particularly qualitative data, but how we can also link those data across studies with other material and sometimes quantitative material too. So each study provides a different insight into those issues. Bringing them together means that we have more than the sum of the parts.
Well, our project is taking a fresh look at two existing data sets. These data sets, one was a project called Fatherhood Over the Generations that included a group of Irish migrants. And the second project was called Transforming Experiences that included a group of Afro-Caribbean migrants. And the purpose of the project was to bring these two data sets into conversation with each other and to look at the ways in which people tell their stories and make sense of their lives, rather than only to look at how they lived their lives and what happened to them.
In present day debate around migration, there's a real turn towards the personal narrative of the successful or the problematic migrant, and actually to be able to take narratives over the life course of real people and to show the kind of complexity of the lives they've built and the challenges involved with that is really valuable.
The project's called Food and Families in Hard Times, Methodological Innovations, and it's about using narrative archival research to get at the food practices of families living in difficult times in different historical periods. And we've been looking at data where food hasn't necessarily been asked directly, and information about food practices has emerged more spontaneously in these diaries and interviews and photographs. The main premise or the background to this project was that food is a difficult thing to research. People do find it difficult to consciously reflect on their everyday routines. So what we have found by looking at this data is that when routines are disrupted, people are more likely to reflect on the everyday. So methodologically, this has been really useful for us.
Family Lives in the Environment is a project which broadly is looking at meanings of environment in everyday family lives across contexts. So we're working with families in India and in the UK. We looked very closely at the Young Lives methodology in order to think about how to design our own work. But then we took those ideas to India and spent a very intensive period piloting there, working with the Indian research team to develop a methodology for fieldwork there, which we then took back and applied to the UK context. We think, along with other researchers in the field, that policy around environmentalism and climate change doesn't capture the complexity of what environment means in everyday life. By working from families' own constructions of meaning, what we're trying to do is to unearth that complexity and the way in which that complexity is situated in social and cultural contexts.
The project was called Possibilities of Paradata, and what paradata are byproducts of social research. And we were particularly interested in the byproducts of a survey called Poverty in the UK, which was carried out in the field in 1967 to 68. There are lots of interesting issues contained in the paradata. One might be around expectations of families and structures. I think the stories about how the field workers responded to doing the interviews and their interviewees and the conditions that they lived in are really useful and interesting for today, because what they show us is the skill and the humanity that is involved in collecting this statistical data.
Recipes for Mothering is a small-scale pilot project which is a collaboration between researchers at the Novella node and the Mode node, which is also based at the Institute of Education. And we took the opportunity of researching food blogs to draw on our shared interests in food and food practices, mothering, narrative research and methods for understanding multimodally digital environments. We were interested in how the written text worked with the visual images as well. So we were particularly interested in blogging as a form of storying or performing motherhood through the medium of the blog. In some ways similar to the ways in which recipes from the past have been read to reveal details about women's lives and their networks and then their priorities and so forth. We were looking to how we might read these kinds of more contemporary media to find out about women's lives. Given that there was so many blogs, there's millions of blogs out there, they seem to us to be a really important potential source of data, but people haven't really known exactly how to work with them. We're just working that out. So this was a pilot project designed to think about what the potentials of the data were, what the constraints were, and how we might work with them as researchers.
One of the most interesting things about Novella is the range of projects and the range of the kinds of materials that have been gathered. Any single project on its own has been very interesting, but for me, what has perhaps been the most innovative is actually putting these all together and saying that actually, when you think about the different historical periods, the different cultural contexts, the different kinds of materials, the archives, the diaries, the paradata, the interviews, the cameras, the maps, putting all of these together in the same room with people from different disciplines, but all of whom share a narrative orientation to making sense of this. That, to me, is the most exciting part. That, to me, is where the innovation lies. Well, thank you very much, Thompson, for loading up the film. And now I would like to introduce Roz Edwards, who we've just seen in the film there. Roz is a professor of sociology at the University of Southampton, and this was where the NCRM Phase 3 hub was based. Roz is a wonderful collaborator. She was a real friend to Novella, as well as an active part of it, as you saw in the Paradata project. And Roz is a co-founder and a co-editor of the International Journal of Social Research and Methodology. And at the time of Novella, she was a co-director of the National Center for Research Methods. So Roz, over to you.
Hi, thank you. So I'm going to sort of delve into a little tiny bit more the background context to the Novella program of what research that you've had some insights into already. But before that, I would just like to thank Julia and Corinne for inviting me. And also big thanks to Corinne for actually organising the event. I had, as Molly said, I got the privilege of being involved alongside the programme in my then role as a co-director of the ESRC National Centre for Research Methods. What I'm going to say is very much my personal view, though it's not an NCRM one. In case you, for those of you who don't know, the ESRC is a public body. It distributes UK government funding for research and training in the social sciences. And as Molly said before, between, well, there were 3 phases to it. Between 2004 and 2014, the ESRC was investing in programs of methodological innovation and capacity building through NCRM. And so NCRM was positioned as a leading body internationally in nurturing innovative methodological development. It's still going as an ESRC centre, but as Julia said, it's now got a more constrained and maybe a less passionate focus on coordinating methods training. Previously, though, as you've heard, the ESRC commissioned what were known as hubs of the research programme. So they were attached to NCRM as the node, the NCRM was the mothership, if you like. And the hubs were competitively funded. The ESRC set up full panels for judging the proposals under calls for NCRM hubs. And it's really only innovative proposals that were making a clear and a needed methodological contribution that were successful. And one of those hubs, which was the narratives of varied everyday lives and linked approaches, known as Novella, which is a genius title and an anagram. And I was the link person to Novella, and I also collaborated, as you heard, on the additional project. That it was an internal NCRM Novella initiative, and luckily it was subsequently extended beyond that through a ESRC cross-investment grant. And as I mentioned in the video, we were working with field workers' written comments in the margins of paper survey booklets, and we undertook both thematic and narrative analysis. And really, it was one of the most absorbing projects that I've worked on, and I got to watch skilled narrative analysts at work. I think of Novella as a very cross project, not in the bad tempered fractious sense. What I'm referring to is that it was cross-institutional, cross-national and cross-disciplinary. And that was one of the reasons why Novella gained funding as a hub. Cross-institutionally, as you've heard, The team as a whole encompassed 6 universities, one of which was in India, and that's the cross-national element. That afforded quite fruitful comparative exploration. And also mentioned, it was cross-disciplinary. It was across social sciences and humanities at a larger scale, and then specifically sociology and psychology. So Novella was an inspirational and inspiring project in these ways, and in several other ways that were attractive to the SRC as funders, and to us in NCRM at the time as promoting cutting-edge research methods and training. The Novella programme was crossed in its methods too. It was an amazing blend of primary and secondary materials. You've got the already existing materials that ranged across data that had been produced for research in the first place and then archived for reuse, and also secondary materials that were produced for other purposes and then used for research. And these were added to by the generation of a range of primary sorts of data. And just looking at the materiality of what Novella was working with, some text, some visual, some audio, some numerical, some were online, some in paper form. And it's easy to sort of hide that motley collection behind the sort of rather grey label of mixed methods. But Novella used the terms linking and matching, and I think that they capture that creative approaches within their set of projects. And the promise of that exciting approach to narrative analysis of the existing data set, and then adding value through reuse and linking them with the generation of new data, that's another reason why the ESRC invested in the Novella Hub. Visuality was also an integral element of the Novella work too. So as well as analysis of visual materials, the team developed graphic renditions of that really complex mosaic of methodological approaches, topics and outputs involving circles and swooping arrows and so on. And you've seen the final version today, but it's also there on page 3 of the book. And there's the lovely result of the collaboration with a filmmaker that we had extracts from just before me. So Novella made a strong, vibrant contribution to NCRM methodological initiatives. We did that through online resources, through holding highly successful workshops and masterclasses and courses and symposia, and also publishing books and articles and blogs. And in my view, the Novella programme was immensely effective in advancing narrative methods and in showing its various forms and strengths. And I echo Julia and Anne in saying I don't think that this far-reaching methodological collaboration could have occurred without the substantial investment that allowed the space for the intellectual experiments and the time for creativity and innovation to flourish. And the Novella team was immensely productive. I recommend that you put Novella publications into the NCRM website search box and see all the gems that come up. And now to add them, we've also got the Researching Family Narratives book, which is a model of how to put across rigorous and complex methods processes in a very accessible and engaging way. And that's why you've logged onto the event. So I'll be quiet now and hand back to Molly and into the panel discussion.
Thanks so much, Rose. That was really helpful. Great to hear about the lessons that you think we can learn from this, and hopefully, despite funding changes and structural changes, take into the future. We're going to move on now to a roundtable session with contributions from 4 other people who were involved with Novella pretty heavily. And that the roundtable actually kind of mirrors quite a lot what Novella did a lot, which you, as you've seen from the film, is to sit around tables with plenty of really nice food and drink and discuss things. So we're going to have contributions from Janet Boddy first, but Janet can't actually be here, so Anne is going to read her contribution. Janet is a professor of childhood, youth and family studies at the University of Sussex, and her involvement with Novella was quite widespread. It involved work on multiple methods, paradata, data reuse, and also research across global majority and minority worlds. So Anne, perhaps you could bring Janet's contribution to us.
Thank you. So now I'm Janet. You saw her on the film, so you know that I don't look like her, but nonetheless, this is what she wrote, and she would have liked to be here. She says, so pleased to see this book published. The ESRC NCRM investment that supported Novella was really distinctive in several respects. I want to highlight two. First, the value of risk-taking and engagement with methodological uncertainty. And second, the value of the collective. I will reflect a bit on what that has meant for me as a researcher. Novella was an ESRC investment in methodological innovation, and that made it possible for us to work methodologically in ways that some funders might see as too high risk or too uncertain. For our project on meanings of environment in the lives of children and families, the risks and the innovation related to two components. First, the application of narrative analytic methods to the Young Lives study, working with data that had not been collected with narrative analysis in mind. And second, the linking of India and the UK in the new data collection, disrupting ideas of comparability and also challenging assumptions about directions of learning between affluent minority and low-income majority world countries. In both cases, the challenges and ethics considerations have wider applicability, including the importance of paying attention to context as inherent to analysis. Our work with Young Lives data and with Young Lives researchers in India and the UK was fundamental to the new data collection and analysis, and it allowed us to achieve the core aim of the project, to build new substantive insights through a new methodological approach. Novella made it possible to engage with new forms of methodological uncertainty. That was possible because of the research relationships involved and the value of the connections across our projects. It was always a learning project for everyone. And even as PI, principal investigator of one of our core projects, I have sometimes joked to people that working on Novella was like my second PhD, but more fun. Working on Novella and working with narrative methodology for the first time in my career taught me to embrace that uncomfortable feeling of being uncertain, to recognize the value of an opportunity to step beyond the familiar. Especially as we get further into our careers, academics can get very fixed on doing what we know. There's the pressure to be the expert and reliably perform our very specific expertise. I was able to learn as much as I did in Novella because we didn't fall into that role. We worked differently, using our expertise to help each other to work with innovation and uncertainty, to question and discover new ideas, and to challenge what we might otherwise take for granted in mutually supportive ways. Novella always exemplified the importance of colleagues, learning through research relationships within and across specific studies. The value of that collective can be seen when we look at this book. Mutual learning and support enriched each of the specific Novella projects, of course, but I think it also shaped us as a group of researchers and thinkers. For me, the work we did collectively, thinking and talking and reading across projects, switched on a narrative sensibility which I've carried forward in my research. I have found this particularly fruitful in working with people in child welfare and social care contexts, which has been the main focus of my research over the years. The work of Novella has given me the conceptual and methodological resources required to understand complex narrative sense-making, avoiding assumptions of simple narrative coherence, and recognizing and respecting the dynamic complexity of interconnected lives. This understanding also helps to address a critical risk in so much research that it's focused on people who live with risk or disadvantage, whether in the context of global inequalities or in child and family welfare contexts within an affluent country like the UK, I would argue that a narrative sensibility helps us as researchers to ensure that we do not reconstruct stigma or create false binaries of the normal and the other in the narratives that we create about the lives of the people that we research, especially when those lives are different to and less privileged than our own. So, Novella has opened my eyes to new ways of thinking and working, and I think I'm a better researcher as a result. I'm delighted that the book gives us the chance to share our collective learning more widely, and I hope that it will change other researchers as it has changed me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anne. That was a lovely account from you and Janet of aspects of Novella that I think we haven't really, some of them at least, talked about yet. So that was great. If we could move on to Rebecca, that would be great. Rebecca O'Connell is a reader in Sociology of Food and Family at Thomas Coram Research Unit. And her involvement with Novella work was quite widespread. I'm just, from the book, she's particularly involved in the archival research on food practices in families and the online blog research. Rebecca, hi.
Hi, thank you so much, Corinne. I'm actually going to cut quite a bit of what I had prepared because I know we're short of time and I don't want to repeat too much of what's already been said. But I do want to start by saying thank you so much to Anne and Julia and Corinne for editing the book, for organising today's lovely event and inviting us all to say a few words. And it's really lovely to see everyone. It would have been lovelier to be together in person, but here we are. So I'm a researcher at the Thomas Coram Research Unit. And as you saw in the film, and as Julia mentioned, the projects I was involved with were on families and food. And we were really trying to understand how food practices which were embodied and embedded in social routines and social relations could be researched. And we were really interested in times of change because, as sociologists like Pierre Bourdieu and Anthony Giddens have noted, this disjuncture between the habitus and the field can really heighten the kind of explicit awareness of the mundane, of the everyday, and shed light on what goes without saying. We were also, with both the blog work that you saw in the film and with the analysis of the mass observation diaries, really trying to understand what we could learn from found materials that, in Ken Plummer's words, strive to record an ever-changing present, rather than through a kind of more conventional interview approach that elicits an evaluative, retrospective account. So in that sense, we were really trying to apply the affordances of more ethnographic approaches or observational approaches to found materials, to traces of behaviour that we treated as data. So you might have heard of, most famously, the University of Arizona garbage project, in which for 2 decades they've been studying people's rubbish to try and understand their lives as consumers. The anthropologist Caroline Brettel talks about doing field work in the archives. So it was these kind of approaches that we try to apply in our work. And I've also gone on to use some of these in my work more recently and in my teaching. So in a module that I lead on ethnography, this year we were at a distance, and we tried to apply analytic autoethnographic approaches to collecting and analysing multimodal data about our own lives in this time of change. And in my undergraduate module on food and society, we are also reusing qualitative data. So again, applying some of these insights, and in this case, it's a beautifully archived data set of Pat Kaplan's called Concepts of Healthy Eating, that looks at food and eating in 1990s Lewisham. I just wanted to mention as well that the work with the mode node was carried out by Heather Elliott, who you saw in the film, and you also saw Abigail Knight talking about the analysis of diaries for mass observation and Ambleside, the Ambleside archive. And I would say it's really important to have a look at the book, because there's some beautiful extracts of both of their field notes in there, which really are very telling. And I wanted to also say that it's very sad that Günter Kress, who was one of our collaborators, has since died. And there are some very beautiful tributes to him, and you can see some examples of his work on the Institute of Education website. So what have we learned from Novella that we've applied in the work that we've been doing, both our research work and our teaching? I'm just going to say 3 things. First off, that using and reusing archival and other materials about everyday life to understand particular research topics and questions is messy, and it's bitty, and it takes time. But perhaps that's really true of most research, whether or not we manage to find the time to do it. Second, making sense of these materials demands that we focus on context and contextualization. This is really important work that takes time and it takes creativity, what C. Wright Mills famously called the sociological imagination. But again, perhaps this is really true of all good empirical research. And the third thing is that this really, the opportunity to explore the affordances and the challenges of these kind of methodological approaches within substantive research projects fosters communities of research practice, as the National Centre for Research Methods recognised. And for me personally, to be able to do so with such experienced and esteemed colleagues has been an enormous learning experience and an immense privilege. And it's wonderful, I think, that this important, insightful, but very accessible book, as Roz said, is now available to contribute to building wider capacity in social research methodology and methods. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. That was really great. Thank you. I think we should move now to Catherine, who is Catherine Walker, who's a research associate in the Sustainable Consumption Institute at University of Manchester. And for Novella, she worked on multiple method approaches again. She also worked on projects around collective reflexivity, and also she was involved with the work across global majority and minority worlds. So Catherine, be good to hear from you.
Thanks, Corinne. And once again, just to reiterate my thanks to you, Corinne, for organising this event, and to Anne and Julia and Corinne for editing the book and for kind of allowing us this opportunity to to share some of the work that we did across the projects. I'm going to be talking about 2 projects which sort of links to the chapters that I've contributed in the book. I'll spend most of my time talking about the Family Lives and the Environment project, but I will also allude to the Becoming Reflexive Doctoral Researchers project, which I worked on with Jo, and I know that Jo is going to spend a bit longer talking about that. So for me, the Novella project has just been so significant in my career development and definitely in my personal development. People have already said what a collaborative project it was, and it really was. And I look back on the project now kind of from the vantage point of being about 5 years post-PhD, still working in academia. I've just started working on my own ESRC New Investigators project. And I'm able to look back on my time working on Novella as an apprenticeship. And I think the best kind of apprenticeship, really, because I wasn't just left to kind of get on with the work myself, although, of course, ultimately the PhD was my PhD. but I was actually working alongside experienced researchers, researchers from different continents, researchers from different stages of their career, from different disciplines, from different institutions. And it was really exciting to be working alongside people and actually kind of exploring together the possibilities of narrative research. One of the first things that I did as part of the PhD work is something that Janet's already talked about a little bit, which was analysing some of the Young Lives qualitative data, which was collected in India for a very policy-focused project. And because it was a very policy-focused project, the data weren't collected with narrative analysis in mind. And so they were quite challenging to work with. But I think through that experience, and definitely through doing that alongside more experienced narrative researchers, I was able to understand the possibilities of narrative research, narrative analysis, using narrative analysis on data that weren't intended explicitly for that reason. And that was something that continued as I worked with the Family Lives and the Environment project to collect new data in India and the UK. And we used a range of qualitative methods. We asked for the families to take photographs. We went on walks with them and recorded the walks. They constructed maps through the group interviews that we did. And we did also do more kind of traditional interviews as well. But working with all that range of data and applying narrative as well as thematic analysis to those data, once again, just helped me to realize the possibilities of narrative analysis. And I think it was partly that gave me the confidence, along with Joe, of course, and it was very much a dialogic and kind of a collaborative decision to embark on a kind of side project around our own experiences, really kind of analysing our own experiences as doctoral researchers. But it was that work with a whole range of data that I think gave me the confidence to think that actually Joe and I could create some data of our own from our own reflections of learning to be reflexive doctoral researchers. And I know Joe's going to talk some more about that, so I won't say any more at this stage, but as I say, it was the confidence I had from having conducted a whole range of narrative analysis on a whole range of other data that allowed for that. And actually, before I do move on to the Family Lives and the Environment project, I would just say I'm really, really glad that Joe and I did that, because it has created what I think is quite a valuable resource of documenting. People have already mentioned uncertainty, documenting the uncertainty and the emotions involved in doing a PhD, but also documenting that really crucial peer support that PhD students give to one another, and often give to one another without really thinking that much about what a valuable thing that is. And I think that experiment with Joe and that kind of creation of a kind of new, very small data set of our own kind of reflections is really valuable for documenting that process. Just coming back to the Family Lives and the Environment project, I have continued to work in the kind of research area of children, young people and their environmental concerns. And I'm really, really delighted that I was able to do my PhD on the family as part of the Family Lives and the Environment project, because it's such a distinctive project, and there are many ways in which it's distinctive, many of which have already been talked about. But I'm just going to draw out two very quickly. One is the common worlds approach to analysing families' interactions with their environments. That's something that we write about a lot in the chapter that's in the book. And it's about understanding that although climate change is an issue that is global in scale. It's experienced very differently by different people all around the world. And all of the environmental challenges that climate change brings are not universally experienced. And there is what we call in the chapter, and what Janet's alluded to already, a negotiated complexity that has to be negotiated within families in particular contexts around how they respond to those environmental challenges. And this helps us to get beyond a kind of one-size-fits-all way of understanding climate change, sustainability, all of these words which sound like policy buzzwords, but actually mean very different things to different people in different places, or perhaps don't have very much meaning in the terms themselves. But when you start to get people talking about their everyday lives, you realize that they do have particular meanings. And then secondly, what's really distinctive, I think, about the Family Lives in the Environment project for me is the fact that it's intergenerational. So my PhD focused specifically on the children in the families that we worked with, but it was really important to be able to analyze what the children were saying in with that kind of wider context of how the family had talked about their everyday practices with regard to environment, and to be able to see in situ family negotiations around the kinds of issues that we were exploring. And so much research with children and young people on environmental concerns, I think, doesn't take into account that kind of intergenerational approach. And that has to do with often where the research is conducted. A lot of research is conducted in schools, in youth groups, increasingly now on sites of climate protest led by young people, but actually doing the research in homes allowed for that intergenerational approach. And then I'll just finish by saying I have continued to work with both of those kind of distinctive features of the Family Lives in the Environment project. I've just started working on an ESIC project, which is all around how families composed of first generation migrants from global south contexts and second generation young people in the UK and Australia negotiate responses to the climate crisis. In a second, I'll put a link in the chat if anyone's interested in seeing more about that project. But this is very much, again, it's intergenerational. The young people in my project are going to be interviewing their parents, and then parents and children will work together on creating some content for a project book. And it is very much concerned with kind of cross-cultural negotiations and of understandings, and getting away from a one-size-fits-all way of understanding sustainability and environmental issues. So it's fantastic to be able to look back on this project, which was so significant for me, and especially fantastic to be able to do that from a vantage point of really being able to see how the things I learned through Novella are now shaping the research that I'm conducting in the present. So I'll pass over now. I think it's probably Jo going next.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. That was so nice to hear about the flowering of approaches that's come out of this work for you. Jo Winter's going to just round up. Jo's a clinician who works in children's social care, but he also teaches in the psychology department at Anglia Ruskin. And his work within this book was a contribution that focused on collaborative reflexivity. So Jo, it'd be lovely to hear from you. Hi.
Thank you, Corinne. Hi, great to see you. And I think just to echo others, I would just like to begin by saying, just extending my gratitude and thanks to Anne, Julia and Corinne for editing the book, and for the invitation to have the opportunity to come today and look back at this project that's been certainly so crucial in my own development too, and just remembering actually that feeling really moved actually, but viewing the film again, and just what a privilege it was to be involved in the project. So yeah, I'm looking back from my position, I guess, working outside the academy, in kind of working and training in family therapy context currently, and my PhD was affiliated to the Parenting and Identities and Practices project, and it explored parenting and identities and practices on popular parenting websites. But it's not, as Catherine's already said, it's not that I'm going to be speaking about today, but actually giving a snapshot, I guess, of our joint chapter in the book. And then finishing just by saying a little bit about the significance of that work and the significance, I guess, of narrative in my own work currently. So yeah, to begin, that snapshot, to give a snapshot of the side project that led to our joint chapter in the book, which I think is chapter 7, and it began. We were in early 2014, so it was in response to being asked to co-present at a conference showcasing Novella at the Research Methods Festival, and that took place in July 2014. At that point, we were each at the stage of transcribing and analysing data and writing up our individual PhD theses, and we made possibly the slightly interesting decision to turn the analytic gaze onto ourselves and our peer-to-peer relationship. So we began recording regular telephone conversations that we were already having, because we about kind of where we were at in our projects and checking in about our individual work. But then we carried out narrative analysis on the resulting data from these telephone calls. And at the time, as Catherine said, we called this an experiment in collaborative reflexivity. And I think our decision was in part informed by the practice of reflexive attention on the researcher participant co-construction of meanings in data, which we were each kind of grappling with in our different ways in our PhD projects. And we did, I think I'll speak for Catherine too when I say that we both felt some discomfort and a sense of exposure actually at the time, but also I think we felt it as when we revisited the data as well in the writing of the chapter. But our hope, I think, is that by homing in so closely on the doing of peer support, that's essential in getting through a PhD, but also in enjoying that journey, that it may potentially serve as a resource that is of value to others, and I think in particular future postgraduates. But so in the process of writing that chapter, we continued our experiment in collaborative reflexivity, and we reflected on the data from, at that point, it was a vantage point of 5 years later, so in 2019, when we both finished our PhDs. And I think it was really striking how generative that process of co-writing continued to be, in spite of the fact that we had gone on quite different trajectories after finishing our PhDs. And I think that the presence of that mutually supportive relationship in the context of PhD work, and probably particularly in such a collaborative node as Novella was, is certainly not unique, but possibly the capturing of it and the exploring of that dialogic mechanism of peer support through narrative analysis, maybe more so, and as I said, hopefully a resource, we would hope. So in our PhDs, we didn't want to foreground the gaze on ourselves, probably partly because it's uncomfortable, but it was such a great privilege actually being part of Novella. Afforded us the opportunity to experiment in that way, I think, and to experience, which I've come to think this is increasingly important in my current work actually, to experience a flavour of what it's like to be researched. And I think in revisiting that project, so 2019, when we started the writing of that chapter, our individual relationships to reflexivity had shifted quite a lot. I think I would be right in saying that for Catherine, it had taken a more backstage position, while possibly for me, it had moved into into the foreground in my work outside the academy. So the work that I did on the side project, as well as my involvement in Novella and training in the use of narrative, has been absolutely invaluable to my current work and further training in family therapy. And that is a context where narrative is central. So the recording and reviewing of therapy sessions, for example, is really commonplace. And that's also exposing and discomforting. But ideas of reflexivity and how we can draw on our reflexivity to address power in the therapeutic relationship, for example, are absolutely crucial. And I wonder if this work shows the potential, I think, of narrative as a means of bridging really quite different contexts. And I think that's really exciting. So while neither of us have stayed still, of course, since we were working, in that more aligned context of Novella, our check-in conversations since then and the revisiting of the project from different vantage points, both in 2019 and now in 2021, continue to be generative. And I think it's the sense making through narrative that's the common thread in that. And yeah, it's just such a privilege to be here again and to be remembering just what a rich project the whole of Novella was. And just, yeah, thank you. And I think that's it from me.
Thanks, Joe, very much. I think that the audience probably by now will have a sense of the intense emotional connection that those of us who worked on this project really experienced. I mean, we talk about researching family narratives, but there is a bit of a sense of a familial bond. But I mean, most of us haven't seen each other in quite a long time. And I know that I, at least personally, just feel absolutely delighted to see these faces of wonderful colleagues. And yeah, hearing Catherine and Joe and Rebecca. Anyway, you will have noticed that we already have, it's 3:30 now. We would like to suggest that we stay on for maybe another 10 minutes in case anybody has any questions. Before we do that, I'm going to invite Anne, I believe, to say a few words, because after, once we begin the questions part, we will stop recording. So, Anne, I will invite you, and then we will stay on if people have questions. Otherwise, we're also happy to finish. So, Anne, please.
I'll be brief, and I think that you can all see that for those of us who were involved, we have so much to say and so many thoughts about Novella that when we get the opportunity, we can go on for longer than we intend. But first of all, I want to thank very much Corinne and Molly for organising this. They've done it through the auspices of their new centre, which I hope that they'll mention, or at least put in the chat in a moment, their new narrative centre, the ANRP. And it's just been a wonderful opportunity for us, and so fitting in terms of the whole Novella project that we should come at the end to doing the launch through their centre. And then the next thing is to thank very much Julia and Corinne for really keeping the book editing project going. And at times, one or the other would really make sure that we and everybody in the book actually produced things. And if it wasn't for that collaboration, we would never have produced this book. And as Ros, I think it was, said earlier, we have produced many things. This is not the first Novella book by any means, but it's across the whole project, and it's great to have it. And it was lovely to work on. I mean, just as coming here today, it was lovely to revisit all the issues and the projects, and great fun. And I want to thank everybody who worked on Novella. I think it's an extraordinary group of collaborative colleagues. Now, maybe people were either self-selecting or it was the case that we chose well or something. But actually, I think you're an extraordinary bunch who have worked so hard. We've talked about it in a way almost as if it was all fun. And I want to point out that it was a lot of hard work, that because it was risky, it was sometimes anxiety provoking, and sometimes we had to rethink, take steps backwards and so on. And I want to point that out because in case people are thinking, well, we couldn't do that, we don't have the resources and we don't have the people, you build the collaboration over time. At the beginning, we didn't all know each other so well. but we worked at it in so many ways, and people were so willing to do that. So thanks to all of you who were involved in Novella. And the next thing I want to say is that, of course, not everything went so well. So we've heard both from Catherine and Joe, and I think it's only fair to say that there was another PhD student, and that PhD never did get written. So just again, I don't want anybody listening to feel that this was somehow something that went smoothly from A to Z and everything was perfect. No, but overall, I think that we contributed in the ways that we wanted to. I want to thank the NCRM of the time, because they were highly supportive, and you've seen Roz and heard what she has to say. And indeed, as Julia, Molly, Corinne said, she is extraordinarily collaborative. She became a member of our team, even if she doesn't recognize that. We felt that she was. And we also benefited from the other people at the NCRM of the time. So thanks to them and to the ESRC for funding so well a project. Without the money, and this is a plea to funders, if you want innovative research that's policy relevant, that makes a difference, that's methodologically cutting edge, that's substantively worthwhile, then it needs to be funded well and not on a shoestring, and we need to be given time. And the very fact that, you know, is it 7 years after the project finished, we're still producing a project book, says a great deal. And we have produced an enormous amount of output. So this has been great value for money, but it took the money in the first place. And, you know, particular thanks from me to Julia, with whom I have worked for almost 40 years. I can't believe it, can't be right. But anyway, but who is always there to step in and discuss things with, and, you know, sort of who was really a great sounding board when we were devising Novella. And thanks to you all for coming. And I hope some of you can stay a bit longer and have a conversation with us, and apologies for talking so long myself, and for us all being so enthusiastic we wanted to talk for a long time as well.
Thank you, Anne. Before we open up the questions, and we do have a few, I would like to say one thing which I'm a little bit surprised hasn't been commented upon yet, despite all of our excitement about talking about Novella. And that is the very, very critical way in which Anne nourished us, not only intellectually, but indeed every time we would come to a meeting, there was the most extraordinary spread of very healthy things like dates and nuts and dried apricots. And you had a choice of tea or coffee, and not just instant coffee, but indeed, you know, the cafetiere kind. And Anne really, really knew what the nuts and bolts of what it took to make people really happy to, you know, have an early morning meeting. So you can see it was a very nourishing place in many, many ways. So, oh yes, and as Catherine says, sweets from India, absolutely. So yes, I think that it's fair to say that this level of working together and of collaboration, and also a very inspiring leadership, really did help to bring out the motivation from all of us, from very different corners of academia to work together, and I think build very fruitfully. So Karen, I would like to ask you if you would like to say your question. Tom, is Karen unmuted now?